everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial in which we're going to be taking a look at the AQA A-Level Law paper, paper 1 from June 2020. We're not going to look at the whole paper in this video because I won't have time to do that. Instead, we're just going to focus on the 30-mark questions that appear on this paper. And this is the criminal law scenarios on paper 1 that are worth the hefty amount of marks. So I've switched my screens over now so that you can see the AQA A-Level Law Paper 1 from June 2020. And you would be allowed 2 hours to answer all of the questions on this exam. Now, we're not going to go through all of the questions on this paper today, but I'm going to scroll through just so you can see what you'd be required to do, and then we're going to focus on the 30 markers. So the first section of this paper are the multiple choice questions, and I have done a separate video on my channel which talks you through how you should go about answering these multiple choice 1-mark questions. And then you can see that it moves on to a 5-marker about the practice statement, a 5-marker about causation in fact and causation in law. We've then got a 10-marker on the Offences Against the Person Act, just scrolling down here to a 15-marker on the meaning of justice. And then here we are, our first 30-mark question, and it's question number 10. So we're going to look in detail at this 30-marker, and then question 11 is also worth 30 marks, so we'll take a look at that one as well. So I'll just zoom in a little bit on this scenario so it's clearer for you. You can see here that we've got a criminal law scenario that's separated into 2 sections, and you've got the question here which is worth 30 marks, and you're being asked to consider the criminal liability of Frank in connection with the £200, so that's what's happening in this section here, and also with the death of George, which happens in this section. So in the first part, we've got Frank going into a shop where he's fitted some shelves the previous week. The owners refused to pay Frank for the work, so when Frank saw a shop assistant counting the money, he snatched £200 from the assistant's hands. So in the exam, I recommend you highlight as soon as you see something in the scenario jumping out at you. The first thing that's really happened there is him snatching £200. So I'll come back to that. As Frank turned to go, the assistant tried to stop him, but Frank pushed him aside. Again, we've got something occurring there to highlight, and he's left with the money. That night, he felt guilty about taking it. He put it into an envelope, went back to the shop, and posted it through the letterbox. First thing we need to do is identify what offence or offences Frank has committed when he's snatched this money from the assistant's hands. Now, I'm hoping that you are thinking theft and robbery. He's taken money, he's taken £200, so straight away that looks like a theft. However, he's snatched the money and he's pushed him aside. So as well as theft, we've also got the use of force. So hopefully you were already thinking this could potentially be a robbery. Now, if you're familiar with the law, and hopefully you are, in order for there to be a robbery, there first has to be a completed theft. So whenever you think that there might be a robbery, I advise you to do the idea, identify, define, explain, and apply robbery. Because as part of that explanation and application, you will be explaining the law on theft anyway, because theft is part of robbery, if that makes sense. And I do have 2 separate videos on my channel, a video on theft, a video on robbery. I've also got videos on how you apply those, so you could take a look at them if you need a refresher on it. But I would be identifying that Frank might be liable, or might be guilty, for a robbery against the shop assistant when he's snatched the money and pushed him aside. I would define robbery, I would explain robbery using cases, and I would apply it back to the characters. Application here, we've got the snatching of the money and leaving the shop with it. So clearly, we've got an appropriation of property to meet the actus reus of theft. However, the facts here say that the owner earlier on in the week had refused to pay Frank for the work. So Frank is taking £200 from the assistant, suggesting that Frank thinks he has a legal right to the money because he's owed money by the shopkeeper. So you would need to talk about the fact that he might not meet the dishonesty requirement for the mens rea, because according to section 21A of the Theft Act, he might be able to argue in belief that he has in law the right to deprive the other of the money. We've got a further problem with the mens rea element in that he felt guilty and later on he returned it through the letterbox. So you'd need to talk about section 6 and the intention to permanently deprive. Even though you might be saying in your answer that you're not certain that he's got the mens rea for theft because of the points that we've mentioned, still go on and consider and say if he meets the mens rea for theft, he could potentially be guilty of the more serious offence of robbery. And that's when you would go on to talk about the fact that he's snatched £200 from the assistant's hands, so whether that's going to amount to force, and also the fact that he's pushed our assistant aside in order to escape. And that's sufficiently proximate to the seizing of the money, and it satisfies the actus reus requirement for the force to be used, quote, immediately before or at the time of the stealing, also meeting the mens rea requirement of robbery. And you could use the case of Lockley there. In our next part of the scenario, Frank drank a large amount of alcohol. There was a report in the pub of the TV, of the incident, including CCTV footage. George, the barman, has shouted at him, "That looks like you, mate." Annoyed that he's been recognised, Frank threw his beer at George. George jumped sideways to avoid being soaked, slipped, fell against the bar counter, broke his skull, and died shortly afterwards. So this is the second part of your answer where you need to discuss what crime Frank might be responsible for with regard to the death of George. So the offence that you would need to talk about here is the offence of unlawful act manslaughter. And that's because Frank has thrown his beer at George. George has jumped sideways to avoid being soaked. So it's clear Frank has committed the unlawful act of an assault by throwing his beer towards George. And that's potentially resulted in George's death. And in terms of application, you talk about the fact that Frank probably caused the death of George by his crime of assault, because the action of throwing the beer is likely to be classed as dangerous because it's foreseeable that there's going to be a risk of some injury when a person responds quickly to avoid being soaked by beer, and so it's created a risk of harm. It's likely that someone might fall, bump into people or objects if they are trying to avoid being covered in beer. You would talk about the causation aspects here, because Frank is going to argue, I imagine, that George has broken the chain of causation. But I would say here that George's response to the threat was foreseeable and it was reasonable, Roberts. So there's a direct link between the assault and the death. And you would talk about the fact that Frank only has to have the mens rea for the unlawful act, i.e. for the assault, not for the death, Newbury and Jones. The fact that he's been drinking, he's going to potentially want to argue the defence of intoxication. However, the defence of voluntary intoxication is not going to be a defence here, and you would use the case of Majewski to support that. So that's what you'd need to do for question 10. Let's scroll down and have a look at the next 30-mark question. So question 11 is our other 30 marker. You can see it here, and you're being asked to consider Isabel's criminal liability for the murder of Harry. So that's quite nice because it tells you what offence to discuss, i.e. murder here. And then assuming she's found guilty, assess the sentencing powers available to the court. Facts are, Harry and Isabel's relationship has become increasingly strained as Harry's behaviours become unpredictable and violent. One evening, Isabel read a message on Harry's phone from her sister. The message read, "Thank you for a wonderful evening, darling." Isabel confronted Harry, accused him of having an affair with her sister. Harry became aggressive, smashing plates, taunting Isabel for being jealous. He shouted, "You're a useless wife. I wish I'd married your sister." Harry was tired, but before he went to bed, he told Isabel he'd beat her up in the morning. About an hour later, when Harry was asleep, Isabel was furious about the events of the evening and the threat that had been made. She was also worrying about what would happen. She took a kitchen knife, stabbed Harry several times, and Harry has died from blood loss. Goodness, so a lot happening there. But first of all, we need to consider the offence of murder. So you would identify, define, explain, and apply the law on murder. I do have some other videos on my channel to help you with that if you want a recap on precisely how to do that. But just to talk you through the key application points here, it certainly looks like we've got a good prima facie case of murder because there's been an unlawful killing of a reasonable person in being under the King's peace with malice aforethought express or implied, because she has killed Harry, and in terms of the mens rea, it looks like she's got intention to kill. At the very least, she's got intention to do GBH. So we do have a case of murder against Harry. However, you're also asked to talk about sentencing powers available to the court. I'm hoping that when you read through this scenario with me, you saw that this could potentially be a voluntary manslaughter case, which would reduce what would otherwise be a mandatory life sentence to a discretionary life sentence if successful. Because we've got Isabel reading a message from her sister and she's suspecting an affair, and she's being taunted and called a useless wife. She's also received threats that he's going to attack her. I'm hoping that you're thinking that this could be potentially loss of control that Isabel could plead here. If she was pleading loss of control, she could potentially argue it through the anger trigger. So due to the violence and the taunt, but it would need to be circumstances of an extremely grave character, give her a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. Also be cautious when you're applying the affair here. You talk about excluded matters and make reference to sexual infidelity, but an affair could potentially be used alongside other matters. You could use the case of Clinton, but it can't be a trigger on its own. We've also got the slight issue that she waits until Harry was asleep. So unfortunately, that's starting to look a bit like revenge, which of course will be an excluded matter. But Isabel may be able to raise the fear trigger in response to the fear relating to the threat that she's going to be beaten up. And you would apply section 55 here. And you would also need to talk about the fact that a person of Isabel's sex and age with a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint, and in the circumstances of Isabel, might have reacted in the same or in a similar way under section 54. So I hope this video has been helpful in just showing you how you would go about answering these 30-mark questions. And as I show you in my step-by-step videos also on my channel, you should use the IDEA method. Identify, define, explain and apply to really maximise your chances of getting full marks.